Yeah, good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our third plenary address. And it's just as great a pleasure to welcome Professor Siba Nziola Grovoguyi. He's going to speak to you. The title of his talk is Mythologies and Genealogies in International Relations, Historiography, Eurocentrism, and Africans. And here to more fully introduce Professor Grovoguyi is a master's, is somebody you know by now, a master's student in the department, is Zwiko Burero Matsiananga. So over to you, Zwiko.
Thank you, Professor. Greetings, everyone. All protocols observed. It was a special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome Professor Siba Grovoguyi to this conference. With a legal background and experience as an assistant judge in Guinea, Professor Grovoguyi is an authority on international relations theory, political theory, and African thought. He is a professor of international relations theory and law at Cornell University in the United States of America. He is also the Nelson Mandela visiting professor in the Department of Political and International Studies at Rhodes University. He is the author of Sovereigns, Quasi-Sovereigns, and Africans, Race and Self-Determination in International Law. And Beyond Eurocentrism and Anarchy, Memories of International Order and Institutions, as well as many articles and books on statehood, sovereignty, international law, and order. His presentation again is titled Mythologies and Genealogies in International Relations, Historiography, Eurocentrism, and Africans. I cannot speak for Professor Grovoguyi, but I know it is going to be a thought-provoking presentation. Over to you, Professor. I thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to start by saying how I wish I were in South Africa. I wish COVID permitted. And I want nonetheless to thank Rhodes University for inviting me to this forum. Sally and her colleagues have been very generous with me in inviting me to be the Mandela Scholar. Sadly, we are living through a pandemic, and that I haven't had a chance yet to actually fulfill my mandate. I wanted to share some thought with you today. And my talk is about mythologies and genealogies in international relations, and they are meant as a provocation. I quite enjoy in provocations, and this is not going to be an exception. And I suspect that people would want to push back some, and I welcome that. The theme of the conference, your conference, is Rethinking Politics in a Time of Crisis. Obviously, as a scholar of international relations and political theory, when we think about crisis, one must always imagine cause, origin, and genesis. One does that with attention to solutions and their instruments. And obviously, all of these are conjoined in our imaginaries and avocations. So I imagine that we all agree that when we talk about a crisis, we talk about causality, a thing that gives rise to an action, a phenomenon, or a condition, is usually understood, which means that we often think of causes in the present, right? And they often have to do with our moral and material economies, how our institutions function and perform, which means our regimes of laws, political culture, and etc. But they also speak to our own individual disposition, because all of those are usually part of the causes of what brings us to the brink, to what we call a crisis. So when we think about cause, we think about triggers and immediacy. When we think of origin, we actually think about the context, in this case, a past. Obviously, one cannot discuss the crisis today in the world as it's a crisis, it's a worldwide crisis of institution, of politics, of morality, of economy, all of them combined. One cannot just think about the crisis in terms of one country, one region, one continent, and etc., even though the crisis manifests itself distinctly in every context. But so as we come from empire, colonialism, and etc., one of course must think of the global economy, political economies, markets, economies of market, of value, of interest. One thinks about the global context, about modes of dispensation, privileges, and immunities for countries, markets, individuals, corporations, different groups, and etc. But those also, one imagines them within certain hierarchies. And they're not just hierarchy of being and of goods and of values, of norms, but they are also hierarchies of what we called in old political thought desert, who deserves what, which implies modes of life, right? Some lives are worth living, some are worth rewarding, some not, and etc. And I'm just going to go through the preliminaries. And then when we talk about genesis, obviously, we think often of imaginaries. The modes, when we say genesis, we are talking about manners and modes of formation of something, how something forms. Obviously, our world would not be what it is today without economies of knowledge, spirituality, sovereignty, and even, yes, violence. So I understand all those to be the context in which I want to talk about the crisis through which we live today, but also to talk about our own vocations and avocations. Because when we think about confronting a crisis, we often don't think about the ethos of our own behavior. What summons us, right? Vocation. What summons us to action is not sufficient. We actually have to think also about the character and nature of our sentiments, right? And the sentiment that go not only in intellectual pursuit, enterprises, but academic pursuit too, but also of our own action. Our dispositions, the character of our disposition toward institutions, toward social order, toward our own relations among us. And when I say us here, it's the entire globe across regions, religions, culture, languages, and belief systems, right? But we also understand that the opposite of ethos is pathos, right? That sometimes our fixations matter. What we are fixated upon, whether it's violence, whether it's pity, sadness, and etc., actually matter, not only to our disposition, but to the ways in which we imagine solutions. So I just wanted to throw those in there so that we understand actually what I'm doing at some point, right? I also understand, now speaking of pathos and ethos, I actually want to speak to the prefixes we use to identify ourselves: anti-colonial, decolonial, post-colonial. These are meant to signify something, things to be remembered by, because if I say I'm a decolonial, anti-colonial, you understand, you associate that with a number of things, right? So these prefixes are identifiers, but they are also signifiers, and I want to talk about that because sometimes in our disposition, we conflate the anti, the de, and the post, right? Anti-colonialism meant something very specific, and post-colonialism also, to those who coined the term, meant something very specific, and people who talk about the decolonial also means something very specific. We confuse them, but they are not. And I wanted to say that. Anti is oppositional, is on the concept of struggle, it means ending. But when you talk about anti, you also have to think about the agendas toward which it points. When you say decolonial, as in decolonial, it suggests that we can remove, reverse, right, in the process of transformation. And the post actually is often deployed in the context of repudiation, abandonment, renunciation, and also transformation. I'm saying this because sometimes these prefixes, we use them almost as postcards, right? Wish you were here. I'm decolonial, so wish you were with me. I'm post-colonial, whatever. Or sometimes we use them almost as an invocation, as in theology. This shall deliver you. If you are not this, you shall not be delivered. And so the D, the pre, and the anti also, it's almost as if they confer upon us grace and justification for what we do, but they don't, is the point I want to say. They don't necessarily, I don't say that they don't, but they do not necessarily. And I think that I want to make the nuance there. Right? Our commitments actually matter more, and they are where I want to start, right? I was talking about Genesis when I started. Just a quick provocation. The decolonial movement today, as it began in Latin America because conquest, the encomienda, and the independence movement in Latin America had particular effect, geographic and spatial. It contemplates the destruction of language, of culture, of people, and it thinks about how to redress that. Post-colonialism and anti-colonialism happened in a context where very few of those were true. Apart from conquest, colonialism, and enslavement, language, culture, imaginaries actually remained. And I want to talk about why that matters. I want to talk about why that matters because the anti, the D, and the post have commonalities, but they are not actually one and the same. And I'm saying this, and I'll return to those, but I want to begin with why they matter. They matter because sometimes our knowledge practices are more theatrics than anything else. And that begins with the disciplines in which we are actually. International relations begins with the idea of the international order, international system, international society. But very often, we actually don't know what they imply by those, except in an extension of what Europe started in 1492. And I'm going to now slow down on this particular part because that is actually at the heart of my presentation today. Why empire should still be the context of the imperial. I'm sorry, empire should be the context of the international. Sorry, that's my. I want to talk about a group of people, Black people, enslaved, called quilombos or quilombolas in Brazil in 1609. Because those people were the first, at least in our diaspora in modern time, were the first ones to confront what it meant to be unfree or enslaved in the modern world. If you enter an international relations class, we often start talking about the international with 1648, Westphalia, blah, blah, blah. And before that, if you're in law, you go to Grotius and etc. But I want to tell you a small story, and then I'll go from that story to tell you something. Consider this. In 1580, between 1580 and 1640, King Philip of Spain united Iberia, and he called it United Provinces. United Provinces has been held by a lot of Spanish people and scholars as a golden era, because under King Philip and the union of the peninsula, Spanish nationals actually knew growth of culture, the art, literature, music, etc. All of it funded by what King Philip was doing in the New World, which is intensified exploitation, extracting goods from the New World and sending it to Spain. So yes, during this time, obviously life was good if you were in Spain or in the peninsula. But this is the thing. King Philip also King Philip also had defeated the Muslim Turks, right? So he imagined that what he was doing was in the name not only of God, of Catholicism, Christianity, but that his mission would redeem all of us ultimately. But that's an aside. What is more important is that he conquered by uniting Spain and Portugal. He also conquered Portuguese colonies, including Brazil. During this time, the golden age of the Iberian Peninsula, for those people, those enslaved, was actually a golden age of repression, not of good life. King Philip had, of course, intensified exploitation in the colonies, doubled the amount of sugar that people had to produce, and then recruited militias to actually intensify again works for slaves to keep work schedules and et cetera, which involved torture, all of that stuff. But the slaves were not the only ones who were subject to King Philip's oppression. The Dutch also were, especially Dutch Protestants. Now, this is the thing. We actually know that. That story is known in our field. What we tend to do in our field, however, is to memorialize what the Dutch did in response to King Philip. And so we talk about the Dutch Revolution. The Dutch Revolution began with William of Orange, his apologia, right? His denunciation of King Philip, which cost him the ire draw upon him the ire of King Philip, and of course, his arrest, repression, and etc. And William himself mobilizing other people toward what they called later abjuration. And I want you to remember that. There was his apologia, denunciation, blah, 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 and abjuration. Because those two acts have been constant fixtures in a lot of revolution. If you read William Jefferson's Declaration of Independence in America, it's actually a combination of apologia and abjuration. King George did this, was King George, and then he says, we declare ourselves to blah, 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 right? So you have apologia is often, and that's the language, and I'm using those two because they are concept and they matter. Even if we don't use them today, they signify something that still we imagine to be the beginning of every revolution. Something interesting about William, a lot of people call him the silent because he was not a man of many words. But we memorialize the event that started in the Dutch provinces, ending up in the 13 Years' War, which ended in 1648, which we say is the beginning of the modern world. And then we imagine republicanism, movement toward freedom, etc., to all flow from that. But on the other side, also under the ambit of this, the sovereign power of King Philip were slaves who were in Brazil, not white, not Protestant, not literate, I'm using that in quotation mark here, but who also sort of seem to have done the same thing, unrelated to the Dutch. They did not know what the Dutch were doing. And I want to be clear about that, because when you talk about these two movements, people think that you are saying that one mirrors the other. They did not know what the Dutch were doing, but they too rebelled against the new regime, right? But they did not begin with apologia, they began with abjuration. They stated that they're no longer exactly in parallel world, that they no longer recognize themselves to be subject of King Philip III, and they were going to establish their own political entity. And later wrote actually in the words of Zumbi, the most known of the Quilombo rulers, the apologia came, right? I did say somewhere that William was known as the silent. Zumbi was never silent. He was very, very loquacious. And it's one of those ironies of history that we know of what the silent said, and we don't know what the very loquacious Zumbi said. But Zumbi actually also sought freedom. And the most interesting part is that Zumbi before him, his predecessors initiated in this new world a constitutional process which has within it all the element of pluralism, because Quilombo dos Palmares was the first entity in the modern world that actually had a constitution in which everybody was equal, no matter your race, your religion, your ethnicity, etc. And yes, it was an independent entity because it even entered treaty with the Dutch colonies around it. Right? But what I'm saying is not simply to say that the Black people too did this. It is actually to hint at different traditions, and I'm going to talk about those traditions. But the beginning part is what we do with those two movements, right? Abjuration, the Dutch abjuration is not magical. We recognize abjuration as a statement of free will, and therefore something which by legitimacy we must recognize as the desire of people to be self-governing. Why don't we do that for Quilombo? Right? And I'm going to say why I speculate, but we don't do that from Quilombo. The other difference is, so in that way, they're actually treated differently. The apologia that comes from Zumbi later is taken almost as an affront to the monarchy, because Black people certainly could not tell a white monarch, Dynas, that their behavior was unbecoming. But if the Dutch say it, it has to be connected to the desire to reclaim independence and etc. Right? And that is, I'm not just squabbling here with words. What I'm trying to say is that is this, that in the history of our disciplines, we seem we seem to almost have abided the idea which was stipulated in the Supreme Court in America by a court in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, that the Negro has no will that the white man is obligated to respect. And I'm not just showing that again, because there is an implicit both disrespect and illiteracy involved in not recognizing how the modern world came together. There's an implicit disrespect and illiteracy. The disrespect has to do with the fact that no matter how effective, how Black people profess it, no matter how they execute their will, we still have a hard time understanding them. And it happens for two reasons. One of them is that because they cannot be related to our canons, right? If it doesn't fit the canons, right? We have established Westphalia as a canon, and therefore it doesn't quite come in that trajectory, then it cannot be recognized as such. Because you imagine falsely that there's a direct link between political thought, political rationality, and political action. And those people whose actions cannot be fit into our own rationalization of what it means to, in this case, be free or to have a republic, cannot be taken to have been such. This is not, to my friend, to say that the originality of canon should be rejected. Canons obviously are original. And in this case, since I'm talking about the Apologia and the Republic, I'm obligated to talk about Locke, right? Locke wrote in his time, obviously in two treatises of government, right, that natural law compelled men, quote unquote, to reject the divine right of kings in order to establish self-government for themselves under common established law, governed by an impartial body that they had elected to enact laws and exact judgment, right? That is true. And that, in the way that is formulated, was very original. This is the thing. Locke wrote his treatise in 1689. By then, Quilombo dos Palmares was already 80 years into existence, which means that though Locke may be original. There is an original political action that comes from Quilombos that preceded Locke. So we can quarrel whether Locke's treatises of two treatises on government, we can squabble whether it was, the originality of it is not in dispute, but whether it was simply intuitive or it was an insight. Right? Most people argue that it was not intuitive, it was an insight. It was an insight in what was beginning to shape up in America and etc., in what had happened in Britain itself under the Long Parliament and etc. And so it was not necessarily intuitive, but it was an intuition. It was an insight, I'm sorry. It was an insight. Why should not Palmares, Quilombos, Palmares give us an insight into modern forms of government? And I'm asking the question, not again to say that political thought may not be original, but political action too might be original. One may serve as a way to understanding that which even preceded it, right? But political action itself has its own originality. It has its own texture. And in the case of Quilombola, the difference between Quilombos and the Dutch is that the Dutch set in place a republic that was also imperial, because they sort of the republic and they went to colonize Indonesia, etc., etc. Right? And of course, fight the Portuguese over the Strait of Malacca, etc., etc. Quilombolas set off a republic that never aspired to be imperial. In fact, specifically denounced imperialism, specifically denounced racism, and specifically committed itself to not see a distinction between men and women. So we have a problem here. We can accept Locke's originality without really abiding Americans who think that they actually followed Locke and that they abided the principle that all men were by nature, men in quotation mark, were by nature free and equal. Where that happened first was not in any European province. It was the Black people in Quilombola who, in their sense, did not write, did not read, and of course, could not be thought to think for themselves. I'm saying this now, and I want to move on to the next phase because I only have 11 minutes left. I'm saying this to caution us against overlooking Black people. What connects the Dutch in the United Provinces in the Netherlands and Quilombos is time. Time. They all lived in the same moral economies, the same physical economies, the same under the same legal regimes, and must have experienced it in the same way. Well, most have all not in the same way, but they may not have experienced it all the same way, but they all recognize it to be unjust and reacted to it. And they could only react to it in the techniques of power, in the language of power that was available to them. That's what time does, right? In that sense, the Dutch and Quilombolas were not really different. So when we talk about modernity, humanism, universalism, we are on a very dangerous ground to try to exclude Black people from that trajectory, no matter what the direction. There was originality to Quilombolas, to Zumbi's apologia, to the constitutional form that was there, but they were all in response to what characterized time at that moment, what the content of time was, its economies of market, of violence, of race, of all of those. And so if one wants to talk about the international, unless you want to talk about the international, to talk about a theory of time without time, you are actually obligated, unless by neglect or by scorn, to take into account other traditions of confronting what that economy was. Those economies were of morals of economy and etc. Because everybody rose up against them. Again, some may have reacted more eloquently than others. And that leads me to where I want to head today. abjuration as a concept, though we may read it differently, though the texture might be different, is what exactly you see in Sobukwe's writing. Abjuration, the right to be free and to self-determine. Self-determination never means staying apart. It simply means, again, going back to Locke, a government in which free expression of the will exists. It's like a marriage. You can opt to be in it or you can opt to be out, but it doesn't mean separation. And I want to say that, and I'm going to give you a number of things. There's something else about, in Quilombo's Dos Palmares, that you don't see in European theories of what I call theories of justice, is abnegation. Abjuration, the double of that in that context, which you don't find in European political traditions, is abnegation. Giving up something that you may want so that the collective can be. Abnegation, you see that in Black traditions throughout, from Quilombolas to Haiti. When Haiti became, after the Haitian Revolution, they declared everybody to be equal, everybody to be Haitian, which meant that, and they said, nouveau riche, nouveau libre, ancien libre, old free and new free, which means that we are tempted always to exact revenge and other forms, revenge and like forms, when we have been victimized in history, right? But something morally inside, internally constitutive, compels us to not do that and to actually give up even more. If you read Nelson Mandela's Rivonia speech, the last paragraph, I have fought against Black domination, white domination, I'll fight against Black domination. That is actually, that has in itself the precept of abnegation, which has been read as naivete by some because he gave up something, or for others to imagine that it's either bad philanthropy, but at least it's an ambiguous gift, and etc. And for some to even imagine that he may have been a fool. If we don't understand Sobukwe and as an act of, Sobukwe's writing as an act of abjuration, and Nelson Mandela as an act of abnegation, is actually a collective failure from us to see that in the Black diaspora, for 400 years, certain ideas have been ours. And it's not just those, it's not just abjuration, abnegation. The third one is outlawry. Remember I said earlier that William had been taught by Philip II to be outlaw. Outlawry was defended by Philip as a principle. And in South Africa, Beyers Naudé defended outlawry. Outlawry is departure from what is common, what is safe, to look for a new beginning. But outlawry is not really seeking disorder, it's seeking a different order. It's repurposing institution, it's repurposing faith, it's repurposing law. That kind of outlawry also from Quilombo to Haiti to people who, anti-slavery movement to the civil rights movement in America, Nelson, Martin Luther King, you actually also see that. Those are our traditions. Abjuration is one, Sobukwe. Abnegation is one, Mandela. Outlawry, Beyers Naudé is African. Yes, I'm saying Beyers Naudé is African because that is an African. I'm sure you know that more than I do. But I want to conclude to something else. There are also in our tradition, one of the most constant principle of order from Quilombo's in 1609 until South Africa, and you can name them, Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Amilcar Cabral, Neto, all the way through. The Maroons in Jamaica and etc. It is that Black people have established as a principle, constitutional principle, the edict of no partial public sympathies. No partial public sympathies. We do not hold that because we are Black or we are darker. Actually, as I said, when I talk about the African diaspora, I do not just mean people of darker pigmentation, which is why I cited Beyers Naudé earlier. But the idea of no partial public sympathies as a constitutional principle goes to all of the questions of public life, of property, of order, of justice, of equality. But most importantly, and this is the part, most importantly, the idea that we should stick to the language, to law as language, but the language of law shall always remain in dispute. So going back to Bayes that day when I was talking about outlawry, it's not actually to dispense with the rule of law. It simply is to say that the content of it has to be reimagined. Because the language of law and law as language are two different principles, and they allow us to do multiple things. Why was I saying all this? It is to say that as Africans, when we say African subjectivity, when we say African institutional experimentation, when we talk about African agency, we're actually not just talking fluff. Africans have been part of this world, never, ever, ever, ever away from it. Africa, from Diogenes, North and West Africa, from Diogenes, 8 centuries after him in the Greeks, every single one of them, the main one, came to North Africa, stayed there, lived there. None of them went to France. So when the French take Greek rationality and make nonsense of it, and I say nonsense of it, we do not reject that because it's French. That idea is not actually French, and it's not uniquely Greek. If you want to know, think of Aesop, a Black slave who was brought to Greece, who became counsel to leaders, to rulers in Greece. Not just one, but multiple ones. Aesop. Just as Pushkin, you do not think of Russian literature without him. Africans and Africans have never been away from the cosmos, from the universe. We have always been part of it. West Africa has always been in contact with Arabia. So has East Africa belonged to the eastern coast of Africa, belonged to the Indian Ocean, to historical political movement, migrations, connections, exchange of ideas, culture, etc., with the rest of the world, with Arabia, Persia, Asia, and etc. I'm saying this because the decolonial people imagined that language was dead, thought was dead. We have, right? The D in decolonial, as I said earlier, just to be coherent here, the D, as I said earlier, was reversal, removal, and extraction and transformation. What we have in Africa, and I want to warn everybody about what we have, myself actually, that's for me more. What we have in Africa is we have had slavery, we had colonialism, we have had a number of impositions, but our languages that I don't just mean Igbo, Yoruba, Zulu, etc. I mean, the manners in which we express ourselves. Nobody ever took that from us. Thought remains. If you go to Senegal today, on any Good Friday, you will hear an imam in a church in Senegal. If it's Tijani quoting from Aristotle and Plato, that is actually the truth today. Our spirituality, our imaginaries are all there available to us for political experimentation. We do not have to shy away from grasping what we have. What we have to do is actually go back to our resources. We have resources with which to think through our own crisis. We have language, we have thought, we have spirituality, we have imaginaries for our own experimentations. That is why I talked earlier about Sebukwe, Nelson Mandela, Bayes Nade, and then went to the Quilombolas. Because we do. And we don't have to make apologies for that. There's nothing, if you put abjuration, abnegation, and outlawry together, there's nothing that John Rawls tells you about a theory of justice that you do not find there, and even more. Which is not to say that you should not read John Rawls. You should actually. But we spend far too much time teaching John Rawls without any context. And we overlook what is before us. We teach in international law classes the freedom of the seas from Grotius. Grotius wrote The Freedom of the Sea as a mercenary track on behalf of an imperial corporation, but we do not dispense with the universal content of what he was saying, however, whatever the motive may have been when he was formulating it. Abjuration, abnegation, outlawry, and the constitutional principle of no partial public sympathies are far more noble. And yet, we don't, as collective abdication, and I'm including myself there, as a collective abdication, we don't see within ourselves the resources to transform our economies. We end up teaching people, having to force people to stretch their mind to conceive of things that could be better given to them if we were just to know who we are, where we have been, and what our trajectories have been. Who we are, what we have been, and what our trajectories have been. We actually have the resources, which is not that we don't learn from others, because we do. In fact, what I'm saying is that we have always been part of time. And as belonging to time, we have been connected to movement around us. Sometimes we are the originality, sometimes other people are the originality. But unless we want to continue to maintain that there's no will that the Black man may express that should be respected by a white person, then we should continue to ignore Africans. That is sin number one. The other sin, where I'm now to conclude today, is the idea that we belong to some parallel universes and that we are so distinct as human beings. Human faculties are universal. Human faculties are universal, and the human genius is evenly distributed. Look at all of your science books today. So we use our resources, we use our faculties, we can get somewhere. And I'm going to stop there. I'll take your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Bref, voilà, merci.
Thank you very much, Siba. Yes, we already have somebody, it's Ebiera Tani, kicking off the question and answering. And so we're going to take questions for about half an hour. Ebiera has a sort of very nice, short and sweet question. And his question is, what is the place of documentation in all of this?
Documentation.
Yeah.
Documents.
Yeah.
No, I'm answering.
Okay.
I would actually substitute to that archives. What are archives made of? Archives are made of things we write down. Archives are made of what we see in the landscape in our bodies. Archives are seen in what people do. And archives, obviously, the beginning of it is the written word, right? Archiving is actually giving systematicity to things. So Grotius's Mare Liberum would not have been anything significant if more than 4,000 people hence had not written about it. And then archived in the process what other people did to confirm his thesis that in fact the freedom of speech should be upheld for all our collective good, right? So of course, when I was telling you about these ideas today, our job in archiving them is actually reading those people and then abstracting from what they did. Not just reading them as freedom fighters, etc., and fossilize them, putting them in these fossils of African resistance and history, but it is actually seeing what they were doing, principles that are both particularly African, but also universal. And so we have to think about how we do archives, which is actually much more interesting for me than just documentation. Because documents obviously are not unproblematic. They are written by people who also have stakes in history, and etc., etc. So yes, I would like to talk about archive, but documentation only partially.
Perfect. Thank you. And so next, it's not really a question, but there's a comment from Ewan Sutherland. And his observation is, it is strange to hear an account of King Philip II without mention of his family, the Habsburgs, and the Holy Roman Empire, and of King William of Orange without mention of differences in religious cults and wars.
Yeah, I mean, my point was not actually to give you an account of that, because you get that in our classrooms every day, but it was simply to make a parallel between that. It was, I was using key concepts: abjuration, apologia, and then justice, right? Comparing that and Kilambulas to make sort of, to give an account of parallel trajectories under King Philip II, but not necessarily to tell you about his biography. I can do that in a different context, but this was not it. This was actually to give you this parallel account of the human trajectory and republicanism and ideas of freedom and collective abjuration and et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you, Siba. And then kind of a next question is from our Sally Matthews. And she says, thank you for those reflections and provocations. Towards the end, you mentioned the universal. Can you say more about this? When insisting on Africa's place in the international, are we insisting on the existence and importance of a separate African political tradition, or are we insisting on the recognition of Africa's place as part of the universal, or something else?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. No, I think I would actually be willing to give a very different lecture on the universal, because the universal as conceived, obviously in European canon, is not what I mean here. The universal simply means that there's a sense in which human faculties, and therefore the sentiment, the disposition, etc., may be connected through time to the conditions and the circumstances of their lives. That if you put humans in parallel situation, they may actually reflect, there may be convergences in the manners in which they both experience that and react to it, right? And at that moment, their reaction to universalism is actually contingent upon the circumstances in which they find themselves. It is to say that there are no humans that are better than other humans, and that our reaction should be taken, right? And this is without, obviously I'm saying this because I contest all these idea of human nature and et cetera, because I don't believe in that. State of nature, absolutely conjured up. But it is to say that humans are capable to have the same responses, and sometimes the responses we have not thought about may be given to us by other people in similar circumstances. And that is why norms actually circulate. They circulate because we find them to be attractive at some level, given the manner in which they pertain to our condition. So when you live under the same condition, there is seldom an idea that pertains to somebody who is similarly situated, right? Seldom an idea from them about that circumstance that other people may not find applicable or interesting, or at least a point of reflection. And that's a different conception of the universal, of how things connect and circulate in function of time, bound by time and circumstance, than saying that somebody issues an edit and we should all do it because it's universal, and because somebody in London said it, it must be universal. That is not, it's a different concept of universal, and it will require a greater elaboration. But if the idea is that human faculties are similar, I adhere to that principle. The idea that human dispositions are never so strange to other human beings if they were similarly confronted by life circumstances, I do not shy away from that. And the idea that the human genius is evenly distributed across time and space, I do not shy away from that.
Thank you very much. Right, we have another comment or another question from Thomas Salmon. So he says, "Dear Professor, thank you very much for this great provocation." Yeah, people like to be provoked, it seems. Okay, it reminds me of a piece that was written by Derrida, which he titled "Admiration of Nelson Mandela, or the Laws of Reflection," in which he deconstructed Mandela's thought and practice through close readings of his speeches and writings. He highlights this practice of abnegation within his article. I wonder if you think that philosophical deconstruction as an approach can be a way to help unsettle and reveal this kind of false universalism. And as a further provocation, as a philosopher born in Algeria, could we even claim him potentially as an African philosopher in this case?
First of all, I actually want to go back to deconstruction. Deconstruction as a technique of reading is, to me, very fascinating, and I actually indulge in it, right? Because I do a lot of hermeneutics. Because I do hermeneutics, I'm actually inclined to engage in something somebody might call deconstruction. But deconstruction is never enough for me. Reconstruction is actually what is interesting, right? Because deconstruction is my own reading. Reconstruction is the moment to which I connect to other people. And as a political theorist, that is actually much far more interesting to me. I'm not illiterate, I'm not into literature. And so that is not a rejection of Derrida. I simply saying that reading for yourself in literature and institutional building are different ends, and therefore they require different dispositions, speaker disposition, right? But I also want to say that what Derrida says will require an entire lecture, because some of which tempt me, some of it not. And I want to say that. The only thing I can say is that Derrida, yes, at some level, and since one of the dimensions of modern life is that we have multiple identities, Derrida, of course, is an African. I just talked about Pius Nader as an African because he is actually an African, right? Derrida is an African at some level, though somebody just pointed in the notes here that Derrida, that human genius is evenly distributed but never acknowledged as so. Derrida was born in Algeria. In Algeria, from 1905 until the end of World War II, in French colonial report, the most frequent theme, right, is la question musulmane. La question musulmane is the question of the order, right? For me, there's something very suspicious about Derrida writing about otherness and philosophy of the subject without recognizing that question originates also much more plausibly in the course of colonial North Africa. Colonial North Africa, it did. And in fact, in that colonial North Africa, we talk a lot about 19th century and anti-Semitism and et cetera. There was a lot. But prior to the question musulmane, one of the things that happened also as question musulmane was a decree by the French authorities called, Décret Crémieux, which gave Jews French citizenship. One of the first political contention in a lot of Muslim and Jewish neighborhoods in Morocco at that time was the fact that the Jews arguing among themselves about whether they should take the Décret Crémieux or not, whether it was a poison gift. And those who accepted Décret Crémieux to become French basically became overnight no longer the neighbor of the no longer the neighbor of the former Arab neighbors, but their overlords. So the Décret Crémieux was actually, so there's a lot of things in the question of order that Derrida could have used to actually modify a lot of his predicates, with which I actually disagree profoundly, which he did not take into account. And that for me is problematic because Derrida ought to have known those. That is, so I put that there. Now, that I consider Derrida an African philosopher, I actually do. And I also recognize Abraham Serfati of Morocco to be an African philosopher. He is an African. Perhaps Jewish, but he's an African, right? So African in this sense is only first whether we can identify with which our locations and whether our topic of conversation engage that which is African, and I putting that loosely. And so I don't want to give people fixed identities. I don't, right? Because it's a function of modern existence that we have these multiple identities. That is actually what makes the modern world modern. One of the things, yes. Yeah.
So I also take it as addressing Ajibola's kind of comment. while we wait for more comments and questions, let me maybe go to something that was still in Sally Matthews's question, and that's about kind of the separateness of an African political tradition. Because I mean, in our country, I mean, there's a lot of debate about, teaching the African political tradition, and she's kind of asking if there's such a separate tradition, or is it so, I guess, intermeshed with other traditions?
No,
yes.
we have distinct African tradition. When I was saying that Karens have their originality, Africans have their own originality. What I was disputing was whether they are so original as to be unrelated to other traditions, right? But what I was giving you today when I was talking about abjuration, abnegation, outlawry, and the constitutional principle of no partial public sympathies, was to say that, in fact, we have a very, very rich tradition that we can teach our students alongside Mills, John Rawls, all of the liberal traditions, right? Not to say that they are necessarily different, they may be, but to actually say that that human pursuit involve those contexts, in the context of John Rawls and the context of Sebukwe, are actually identical. So if we bring John Rawls to our class in Stellenbosch, in University of Cape Town, or Wits, and etc., we ought to actually allow our students to seriously contend with what is being argued there. Again, as I said, one can take a treatise like the Law of the Sea, which was made on behalf of merchants who were actually in the process of conquering other people, which is much less nobler than, say, somebody who's actually trying to think about freedom. But our flaw, our collective obligation has to do with the fact that we never thought that Africans possess ideas either fully expressed or through their action from which you can abstract certain notions of, say, justice or equality and etc., that may actually be taught alongside others. But to imagine that because, and that gives, so there is a content to those debates in South Africa, as I was saying, as there is content to it in America, as there is content to it in among Quilombos. But what I was also saying is that Africans, not because they are Black, but because they experience the modern world in a particular way, and so the face of the human in particular circumstances, you can find Quilombolas stating the principle of no partial public sympathies. You find it in Frederick Douglass, an ex-slave defending the right of Chinese to be American citizen. You can find it in Martin Luther King Jr. speech here, the Black boy and the white girl holding hand, etc., etc. That comes from our experience with the violence of the economies, of morality, of ethics, of law, of the modern world. So we have that, we came up with that, and I say we now, as in the collective Black diaspora, Africana diaspora, we have that not because our skins are what it is that through studying that, we actually also understand how the modern world came to be. So we not only get acquainted to how people react, how the modern world came to be, but we also acquaint ourselves with how people reacted to them. Right? That is why we ought to study those traditions as African traditions. Right? That is very different from Locke, for instance, around property, who's only drawn to the rule of law after property has been taken from natives. Of course, if after property has been taken from the native, you have rule of law, it's not really rule of law. If government only comes after Virginia, you have displaced all the natives and you self-constituted government, that is actually problematic, right? But the principle of self-government nonetheless stands, and the principle of property also stands. Now, if we want to understand how you extract yourself from the quandary in which both thought and legislation of property has happened under empire, colonialism, apartheid, and all the rest, you have to think about the power and the value of what Mandela said at Rivonia. He said in Rivonia in relation to political power, but you can also imagine that to be what it means. If somebody says, I spare you violence and I will never do this to you, the response would have been, oh, thank you, guy, right? There is a responsibility there to which we never responded. The abnegation requires another hand. That hand was never extended. And we have to actually acknowledge that. Abnegation means that I forgive what you did to me, I even let you, but nobody said, okay, by the way, the property here is what we do with it. If we teach to ourselves, African, not just South Africa, but everywhere, the power of that gesture and how that can lead to a different kind of morality around property, around wealth, around a different disposition toward our neighbors. We haven't done that, and that's a collective application. We haven't done that also because we are busy. Now I'm talking about me as Black African. As I said, Africans are not just Black. Africa is not a Black continent. As a Black African, we have not done that because we just say, freedom, freedom fighter, opposition. The anti was not always oppositional. The anti was also constructive. There's a constructive moment, which is why I wanted to talk about Quilombo constitutionalism. Resistance was not just, we resist, we oppose, we whatever. It was actually composing. What happened in the composition? What happened in the moment of composition? Did the Blacks, on behalf of whom Frederick Douglass spoke, did they understand Frederick Douglass? Did the whites who received Frederick Douglass actually make sense of Frederick Douglass in their own disposition toward the Blacks? Right? We have to develop theories around those moments. Because those moments in thought are moments that happen in the Africana diaspora, right? But when we come to the moment of constitutional resolution, etc., freedom is freedom, right? In the end, freedom is freedom. Justice is justice. So why would you say that Africans are any different from the other ones? But the tradition simply give us different resources, different ways of thinking about, again, as I speak always of time, in our times, to think about where we are and what we can do. Different traditions give us different ways of thinking about those. And we cannot understand each other if the integrity of those traditions are not kept. We actually have to keep them in their own integrity as such. And then we can see how what they convey and how they might be transported and what we make sense of. That is what the academies are. That's what traditions are for. Traditions are not there to say, it's mine, it doesn't apply to you, right? Or you can't think like that because you are white. Or it's not that, right? So I was talking about outlawry. I talked about two Dutch, William of Orange and Beyers Naudé. Dutch for Naudé in quotation mark because he's actually African. But I also talk about outlawry among the Quilombo and outlawry with the Maroons in Jamaica. They come in the concept of different traditions, but they are outlawry nonetheless. They are this idea that the old, what no longer makes sense, should be dispensed with for the new. And how you go about that is what we have theorized about. So in Africa, generally, we have totally abdicated so fascinating idea of resistance that we actually don't think about what happened in the process of composition. What did those people do? What were they aiming at? What philosophical principles are in that? What is in that is human? What is in that is universal? What is that connected with other people? What is in that reminds you of something else? Or what has somebody else done that may help you even expand and broaden that we have just learned? Right? But we don't. So you have streets called Sobukwe, Mandela, and etc. Abdication, abjuration, abnegation, whatever. No. Those are far more consistent concepts, far more interesting, right, than just philanthropy, because a lot of think or goodwill. Abnegation is not goodwill, it's not philanthropy, it's not naivety either. It's a profound philosophical principle about how we ought to live together. The oughtness of it has not been understood, has not been grasped, and we have not taught it to ourselves and to our own detriment, frankly. Yes.
Yeah, I think, yeah, well, my experience is I'm very much a student at your feet here. And then I think many others are also experiencing it. And then here's kind of Sally is asking sort of kind of coming out of that direction of wanting to learn more. I think that's maybe that's how she's experiencing.
That's how I'm experiencing.
She's much more familiar with your work than me.
Yeah, no. But again, I said we Africans, including you, me, Sally, and we are all in this.
Yeah, no.
That's. But we are talking to one another, and I take it that way actually. Thank you. But I'm learning from you too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Right. So Sally has just a kind of has a further question, and she says, "Do you have any recommendations for readings related to Colombo dos Palmares and its implications for political or IR theory?"
I'm writing the book actually right now as we speak. That's the thing. We have not done it in the past, and it's very late. But you know, the first essay I wrote about quilombolas, I took it to Brazil in Rio. A young man, I could even forward it to you. He wrote, he said, there's no word in the English or Portuguese language to say thank you, because none of us has ever imagined that Quilombo could be the context for thinking theories about the international. That is serious. At PUC, Pontifical University, which is the premier higher institution in Brazil, right? Because we have not thought to imagine Black people that way. But that is also, now to go back to the question of race, that is a question of race. That rationality and Blackness were never associated together. So we imagine that if Black people do something simply is that, oh, Mandela must be nice, it's different. And we don't connect that to long traditions of exercise, mental exercise to want to see the world differently. So we think Mandela is an exception. Sebukwe, well, a bit too strong-headed, maybe, whatever. Yes, even in that sense, he still is expressing something. Right? But that is, again, I come back to that always. It's our fault to just think of them resistors. And this, no. There was actually also in the business of composition, of helping us think about the world, ourselves, our place in it, and et cetera, et cetera. And we should study that. So I'm saying that I'm writing about Quilombo now, precisely in these traditions, and I'm ashamed to say that, yeah, it hasn't done before. It doesn't make me any different. It just means that I stumbled upon something. And I'll do it. And now, when I come to Rhodes University as a Mandela scholar, then I elaborate on these themes. I'll take a day for each one of the themes I brushed up today, and maybe we can talk about Quilombola. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I mean, yeah, so I don't mean to sort of hog the conversation, but there are other comments, and I mean, as you speak, so I teach on on human rights, international human rights, and we read one of your articles on human rights, and kind of what you've been saying now sounds a lot like your thinking around kind of the concept of the human in the Haitian Revolution.
Yeah.
Right. And so it yeah, I was wondering, you know, kind of how would you see, you know, I don't know how you've been a professor for.
No.
So kind of if do you see an arc in your life, yes, and in your thinking and your work, and how would you describe that?
Yeah, it simply is to say that we don't know the human unless we know the human story. That is as simple as that, right? If you take just the question of human rights, institutionally, I'm not now talking about the theories of it. I'm talking about institutional enactment of it. The Haitian Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. The French Revolution committed to giving people as human the right to citizenship. Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et du citoyen. The citizen is a human being in a particular capacity, in relationship to government, his access to it, and his own enactment of that government. But it's the human in a very particular capacity. And yes, Africans should actually read that, because that question of citizenship matters to Africans as well. The first 10 amendments to the American Constitution are about human individual rights. The individual is human in a particular capacity, severed from the state, in civil society, involving his own activities, and et cetera, right? The right to bear, to speech, free speech, gun, to own gun, blah, blah, all those. But the individual is a human in a particular capacity. Here it is. Haitians, without elaborating it, imagine that the human is not always in a society, because the slave was neither citizen nor individual. But Haitians also knew that the language of the 18th century was that, and they took this seriously, that humans have faculties we have to protect in order for humans to be human. So Haitians said, humans have certain faculties that need to be protected. whether they are in civil society, whether they are disowned by the state, whether they are homeless when they are born and when they die. Right? And so they imagine those rights, which they never labeled either individual or citizen, right? But they belong to persons, right? The right to access to food, to shelter, to etc. In our own mendacity, collective mendacity in political theory, we call that economic rights. No, they may be the most difficult for us to guarantee in the Republic, I mean the Republic writ large, but those are actually the most human of rights, because those things we call civil and political rights can only be gained if you actually have a political order. The ones the Asians are talking about apply to human beings when you are born, when you die, whether you are slave, whether you are in government, whether you are homeless, you are dispossessed, you are prostitute, you are on the street of New York, and etc. etc. Right? That we have to insist upon them, that those are not just socio-economic rights. They actually go to the heart of what in 18th century people called protective faculties. The right to shelter is a human right. We can't relegate that to economic and social right or cultural right. That contempt is what, that conceit, I'm sorry, is what I wrote against. No, if in fact we have to do the Amartya Sen thing about hierarchy of needs, what the Haitians were talking about was far more human in its essence than the individual right and citizenship right, because those actually can only be afforded to you once you are in the political social order. So in fact, we reversed it. What we call social and economic order is actually human right, and those ones we call civil and political are actually social-cultural, because they can only be attained in a particular social-cultural order. Right? Again, I caution all of my African friends, I'm not dispensing with any of them. I want to take them all together, because that's what the human condition coming out of the 18th century made us desire. Just because it's the originality of Haitians to have gone there first, but it doesn't make it less of universal principles, because they were said by Black people who did not write. They actually were touching upon something that is fundamentally human. So I am not saying give those up, right? And on that note, I actually want to say, this is what I tell people in Guinea. I've said this in Guinea multiple times, people even roll their eyes now. When our African leaders say, when they smack people on the street, and you want to say, they say, oh, talk of human rights, that's white people's thing. That is one of the most bogus things that has ever been uttered. Most of what we call civil and political rights today came, yes, from Black people. Quilombolas, when Quilombolas outlawed torture, when Quilombos dos Palmares in Brazil, those Black people outlawed torture, the commissioner of torture that year, you can Google, all of your listeners can Google, the commissioner of torture that year was Francis Bacon, the father of empiricism. Francis Bacon will still imagine that human beings experience torture differently. Torture can be the exception for white people. For Black people, it can be a permanent condition. You can keep them tortured on the slave plantation, is okay, because their experience ends differently. But Black people in Quilombolas thought that torture was not acceptable for any human being. That Black people said before any European penned political and civil rights. So when African leaders do the nonsense, and not all of them, but those who do, and they say, civil rights, human rights is white people thing. No. It actually came from us. Between the slave and the slave owner, it could only have been possible for the slave to say, you shall not beat me again, sir. The first reaction came from the slave, not from the slave owner. The slave owner had it as an insight. The slave as an intuition, as a matter of experience. So those do not come from us from the West, we enacted them. It is again our collective abdication that we don't even know what those things are, because we were the ones beaten, we were the ones deprived of liberty, we were the ones who had no access to this public square. We are the ones who initiated civil rights. And then some dude tells me in Africa, those are white people's thing. No. White people do not give credit to us, but we actually, anyway, I stopped there, but you got me going, right? So it simply is that unless you understand the Haitian, what the Haitians were aiming for, you actually don't understand human rights in fullness. That's all the point is there. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so we're out of time because we have a few research committee meetings starting in a couple at 4:30 our time. But there were just two kind of in the end they're not. So one comment from Ebier, and firstly he's just saying, "I'm very glad that you are writing your book." Right, that's I think one sentiment that's shared by many of us, and then a second sentiment shared by Chris Ezike, and I think you kind of answered his question, was simply that this was a brilliant presentation and discussion. And I think those are kind of the two of the main sentiments that I think we can leave with. So thank you very much, Professor Grovogu.
I want to thank you, but I beg to differ on the brilliantness. My mother always said that I never forget to show up with my tongue. I often forget my head. I simply hope that today I brought my head along with my tongue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And